There was no one else on the beach so late in the afternoon. She walked very close to the water, where there was a rim of hard, flat sand, easier on her feet than the loose shelves of shingle, which folded one on top of the other, up to the storm wall. She thought, I can stay out here just as long as I like. I can do anything I choose, anything at all. For now, I am answerable only to myself. But it was an unpromising afternoon, already half dark, an afternoon for early tea and banked-up fires and entertainment on television, and a small thrill went through her as she realized that that too was entirely up to her. She could watch whichever program she chose, or not watch any at all. There had not been an evening for the past 11 years when the television had stayed off, and there was silence to hear the ticking of the clock and the central heating pipes. It is her only pleasure, she used to say. She sees things she would otherwise be quite unable to see. The television has given her a new lease of life. You're never too old to learn. But the truth, her mother had watched variety shows, Morecambe and Wise, and the black and white minstrels, whereas she herself would have chosen BBC Two and something cultural or educational. I like a bit of singing and dancing. It cheers you up, 𝐒𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐞. It takes you out of yourself. I like a bit of spectacular. But tonight there might be a play or a film about Arabia or the archipelagos or a master class for cellists. Tonight she would please herself for the first time. Because it was 2 weeks now since her mother's death, a decent interval. It was February. It was a cold evening. As far as she could see, the beach and the sea and the sky were all gray, merging into one another in the distance. On the day of her mother's funeral, it had been blowing a gale, with sleet. She had looked round at all their lifeless, pinched faces under the black hats and thought, this is right. This is fitting. That we should all of us seem bowed and old and disconsolate. Her mother had a right to a proper grief, a proper mourning. She had wanted to leave the beach and walk back. Her hands were stiff with cold inside the pockets of her navy blue coat. Navy, she thought, was the correct first step away from black. She wanted to go back and toast scones and eat them with too much butter, of which her mother would have strongly disapproved. We never had it. We were never allowed to indulge ourselves in rich foods. And besides, they've been discovering more about heart disease in relation to butter. Haven't you read that in the newspapers, 𝐒𝐭𝐴? I'm surprised you don't pay attention to these things. I pay attention. I don't believe in butter at every meal. Butter on this, butter with that. Every morning her mother had read 2 newspapers from cover to cover, the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mirror, and marked out with a green ballpoint pen news items in which she thought that her daughter ought to take an interest. She said, I like to see both sides of every question. And so, whichever side her daughter or some visitor took, on some issue of the day, she was informed enough by both her newspapers to take the opposing view. An argument, she had said, sharpened the mind. I do not intend to become a cabbage, 𝐒𝐭𝐴, just because I am forced to be bedridden. She had reached the breakwater. A few gulls circled, bleating, in the gunmetal sky, and the waterline was strewn with fish heads, the flesh all picked away. She thought, I am free. I may go on or go back, or else stand here for an hour. I am mistress of myself. It was a long time since she had been out for so long she could not quite get used to it, this absence of the need to look at her watch to scurry home. But after a while, because it was really very damp and there was so little to see, she did turn, and then the thought of tomorrow and the outing she had promised herself to buy new clothes. It would take some months for her mother's will to be proven, the solicitor had explained to her. Things were generally delayed, but there was no doubt that they would be settled to her advantage, and really, Mrs. Fanshawe had been very careful, very prudent, and so she would not be in want. Meanwhile, perhaps an advance for immediate expenses? Perhaps £100? When the will was read, her first reaction had been one of admiration, she had said, the cunning old woman under her breath, and then put her hand up to her mouth, afraid of being overheard. The cunning old woman. For Mildred Fanshawe had saved up $6,000, scattered about in bank and savings accounts. Yet they had always apparently depended upon Esme's salary and the old age pension. They had had to be careful, she said, about electricity and extra cream and joints of beef. Extravagance, Mrs. Fanshawe said. It is a cardinal sin. That is where all other evils stem from, Esme. Extravagance. We should all live within our means. And now here was $6,000. For a moment or two it had gone to her head. She had been quite giddy with plans. She would buy a car and learn to drive, buy a washing machine and a television set. She would have a holiday abroad and get properly fitting underwear and eat out in a restaurant now and again. She would, but she was over 50. She should be putting money on one side herself now, saving for her own old age. And besides, even the idea of spending made her feel guilty, as though her mother could hear. Now, what was going on inside her head, just as, in life, she had known her thoughts from the expression on her face. She had reached the steps leading up from the beach. It was almost dark. She shivered then in a moment of fear and bewilderment at her new freedom, for there was nothing she had to do. She could please herself about everything, anything, and this she could not get used to. Perhaps she ought not to stay here. Perhaps she could try and sell the house, which was really far too big for her. Perhaps she ought to get a job in a small flat in London. London was the city of opportunity. She felt flushed and a little drunk then. She felt that all things were possible, the future was in her power, and she wanted to shout and sing and dance, standing alone in the February twilight, looking at the deserted beach. All the houses along the seafront promenade had blank black windows, for this was a summer place. In February, it was only half alive. She said, "And that is what I have been. But I am 51 years old, and look at the chances before me." Far out on the shingle bank, the green warning light flashed on off, on off. It had been flashing the night of her mother's stroke. She had gone to the window and watched it, and felt comforted at 3 a.m. in the aftermath of death. Now, the shock of that death came to her again like a hand slapped across her face. She thought, "My mother is not here. My mother is in a box in the earth." And she began to shiver violently, her mind crawling with images of corruption. She started to walk very quickly along the promenade and up the hill towards home. When she opened the front door, she listened, and everything was quite silent, quite still. There had always been the voice from upstairs, Esme, and each time she had wanted to say, Who else would it be? And bitten back the words, only said, "Hello, it's me." Now, again, she called, "It's me. Hello." And her voice echoed softly up the dark stairwell. When she heard it, it was a shock. For what kind of woman was it who talked to herself and was afraid of an empty house? What kind of woman? She went quickly into the sitting room and drew the curtains, and then poured herself a small glass of sherry, the kind her mother had preferred. It was shock, of course, they had told her, all of them. Her brother-in-law and her Uncle Cecil and cousin George Golightly, when they had come back for tea and ham sandwiches after the funeral. You will feel the real shock later. Shock is always delayed. Because she had been so calm and self-possessed, she had made all the arrangements so neatly, they were very surprised. If you ever feel the need of company, Esme, and you will, of course you must come to us. Just a telephone call, that's all we need. Just a little warning in advance. You are sure to feel strange. Strange? Yes. She sat by the electric fire. Well, the truth was she had got herself thoroughly chilled, walking on the beach like that so late in the afternoon. It had been her own fault. After a while, the silence of the house oppressed her, so that when she had taken a second glass of sherry and made herself a poached egg on toast, she turned on the television and watched a variety show because it was something cheerful and she needed taking out of herself. There would be time enough for the educational programs when she was used to this new life. But a thought went through her head, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. It was as though she were reading from a tape. She is upstairs. She is still in her room. If you go upstairs, you will see her, your mother. The words danced across the television screen, intermingling with the limbs of dancers, issuing like spume out of the mouths of comedians and crooners. They took on the rhythm of the drums and the double basses. Upstairs, in her room, upstairs, in her room, your mother, your mother, your mother, upstairs. She jabbed at the push button on top of the set, and the pictures shrank and died. There was silence, and then she heard her own heart beating and the breath coming out of her in little gasps. She scolded herself for being morbid, neurotic. "Very well then," she said. "Go upstairs and see for yourself." Very deliberately and calmly, she went out of the room and climbed the stairs and went into her mother's bedroom. The light from the street lamp immediately outside the window shone a pale triangle of light down onto the white runner on the dressing table, the white lining of the curtains and the smooth white cover of the bed. Everything had gone. Her mother might never have been here. Esme had been very anxious not to hoard reminders, and so, the very day after the funeral, she had cleared out and packed up clothes, linen, medicine, papers, spectacles. She had ruthlessly emptied the room of her mother. Now, standing in the doorway, smelling lavender polish and dust, she felt ashamed, as though she wanted to be rid of all memory, as though she had wanted her mother to die. She said, "But that is what I did want, to be rid of the person who bound me to her for 50 years. She spoke aloud into the bedroom. "I wanted you dead." She felt her hands trembling and held them tightly together. She thought, "I am a wicked woman." But the sherry she had drunk began to have some effect now. Her heart was beating more quietly, and she was able to walk out into the room and draw the curtains, even though it was now unnecessary to scold herself for being so hysterical. In the living room, she sat beside the fire reading a historical biography until 11 o'clock. When her mother was alive, she had always been in bed by 10, and the fears had quite left her. She felt entirely calm. She thought, "It is only natural. You have had a shock. You are bound to be affected." That night she slept extremely well. When she answered the front doorbell at 11:15 the following morning and found Mr. Amos Curry, hat in hand, upon the step, inquiring about a room, she remembered a remark her Uncle Cecil had made to her on the day of the funeral. "You will surely not want to be here all on your own, Esme, in this great house. You should take a lodger." Mr. Amos Curry rubbed his left eyebrow with a nervous finger, a gesture of his because he was habitually shy. "A room to let," he said, and she noticed that he wore gold cufflinks and very well-polished shoes. "I understand from the agency. A room to let with breakfast." "I know nothing of any agency. I think you have the wrong address." He took out a small loose-leaf notebook. "Number 23, Park Close." "Oh no, I'm so sorry. We are—" She corrected herself. "I am 23 Park Walk." A flush of embarrassment began to seep up over his face and neck like an ink stain. He loosened his collar a little until she felt quite sorry for him, quite upset. "An easy mistake, a perfectly understandable mistake. Mr. Please do not feel at all. Curry, Amos Curry." Embarrassed. "I am looking for a quiet room with breakfast. It seemed so hopeful. Park Close. Such a comfortable address." She thought, "He is a very clean man, very neat and spruce. He has a gold incisor tooth, and he wears gloves." Her mother had always approved of men who wore gloves. So few do nowadays. Gloves and hats. It is easy to pick out a gentleman. Mr. Curry also wore a hat. "I do apologize, madam. I feel so— I would not have troubled— No, no, please. I must look for Park Close, number 23. It is just around the bend, to the left, a few hundred yards. A very secluded road. Like this. This road is secluded. I thought as I approached this house how suitable I feel one can tell. A house has a certain— But I am so sorry." He settled his hat upon his neat gray hair and then raised it again politely, turning away. She took in a quick breath. She said, "What exactly— that is to say, if you are looking for a room with breakfast, I wonder if I—" Mr. Amos Curry turned back. He held a small pickled onion delicately on the end of his fork. "There is," he said, "the question of my equipment." Esme Fanshawe heard his voice as though it issued from the wireless. There was a distortion about it, a curious echo. She shook her head. He is not real, she thought. But he was here, Mr. Amos Curry, in a navy blue pinstripe suit and with a small neat darn just below his shirt collar. He was sitting at her kitchen table, for she had hesitated to ask him into the dining room, which in any case was rarely used. The kitchen had seemed a proper compromise. He was here. She had made a pot of coffee, and then, after an hour, a cold snack of beef and pickles, bread and butter. Her hands were a little moist with excitement. She thought again how rash she had been, she said. He is a total stranger, someone from the street, a casual caller. I know nothing at all about him. But she recognized the voice of her mother then and rebelled against it. Besides, it was not true, for Mr. Curry had told her a great deal. She thought, this is how life should be. I should be daring. I should allow myself to be constantly surprised. Each day I should be ready for some new encounter. That is how to stay young. She was most anxious to stay young. In his youth, Mr. Curry had been abroad a great deal, had lived, he said, in Ceylon, Singapore, and India. I always keep an open mind, Miss Fanshawe. I believe in the principle of tolerance. Live and let live. Nation shall speak peace unto nation. Oh, I do agree. I have seen the world and its ways. I have no prejudices. The customs of others may be quite different from our own, but human beings are human beings the world over. We learn from one another every day. By keeping an open mind, Miss Fanshawe? Oh, yes. You have traveled? I have visited Europe. Not too far afield, I'm afraid. I have journeyed on foot through most of the European countries. I have earned my passage at all times. She did not like to ask how, but she was impressed, having only been abroad once herself, to France. Mr. Curry had been an orphan, he said. Life for him had begun in a children's home. But it was a more than adequate start, Miss Fanshawe. We were all happy together. I do not think memory deceives me. We were one big family. Never let it be said that the society did not do its best by me. I see how lucky I am. Well, you have only to look about you, Miss Fanshawe. How many people do you see from broken families, unhappy homes? I know nothing of that. I count myself fortunate. I like to think I have made the best of my circumstances. His education, he said, had been rather elementary. He had a good brain which had never been taxed to the full. Untapped resources, he said, pointing to his forehead. They talked so easily. She thought she had never found conversation flowing along with any other stranger, any other man. Mr. Curry had exactly the right amount of formal politeness, mixed with informal ease, and she decided that he was destined to live here. He had style, and he seemed so much at home. He had an ordinary face for which she was grateful, but there was something slightly unreal about it, as though she were seeing it on a cinema screen. All the same, it was very easy to picture him sitting in this kitchen, eating breakfast before putting on his hat, which had a small feather in the band, each morning and going off to work. I do have some rather bulky equipment. What exactly? I have 2 jobs, Miss Fanshawe, 2 strings to my bow, as it were. That surprises you? But I have always been anxious to fill up every hour of the day. I have boundless energy. She noticed that he had some tufts of pepper-colored hair sprouting from his ears and nostrils, and wondered if, when he visited the barber for a haircut, he also had these trimmed. She knew nothing about the habits of men. Of course, it is to some extent seasonal work. Seasonal. Yes, for those odd, wet, and windy days which always come upon us at the English seaside, and of course during the winter I travel in cleaning utensils. He looked around him quickly, as though to see where she kept her polish and dusters and brooms, to make note of any requirements. Perhaps you would require some extra storage space, other than the room itself. Mr. Curry got up from the table and began to clear away dishes. She watched him in astonishment. The man on the doorstep with a note of the wrong address had become the luncheon visitor, the friend who helped with the washing up. There is quite a large loft. Inaccessible. Oh, and I do have to be a little careful. No strain on the back. Not that I am a sick man, Miss Fanshawe. I hasten to reassure you, you will not have an invalid on your hands. Oh no. I am extremely healthy for my age. It is because I lead such an active life. She thought of him, knocking upon all the doors, walking back down so many front paths, though this was not what he did in the summer. Sound in wind and limb, as you might say. She thought of racehorses, and tried to decide whether he had ever been married. She said, or else perhaps the large cupboard under the stairs where the gas meter. Perfect. He poured just the right amount of washing up liquid into the bowl. His sleeves were already unbuttoned and rolled up to the elbows. His jacket hung on the hook behind the back door. She saw the hairs lying like thatch on his sinewy arms, and a dozen questions sprang up into her mind. Then, for although he seemed to have told her a great deal about himself, there were many gaps. He had visited the town previously, he told her, in the course of his work, and fell for it. I never forgot it, Miss Fanshawe. I should be very happy here, I told myself. It is my kind of place. Do you see? And so you came back. Certainly. I know when I am meant to do something. I never ignore that feeling. I was intended to return here. It is rather a small town, but select. I was only wondering, we do have a very short season, really only July and August. Yes? Perhaps it would not be suitable for your, summer work? Oh, I think it would, Miss Fanshawe. I think so. I size these things up rather carefully, you know, rather carefully. She did not question him further, only said, well, it is winter now. Indeed, I shall, to coin a phrase, be plying my other trade. In a town like this, full of ladies such as yourself, in nice houses with comfortable circumstances, the possibilities are endless, endless. For, cleaning materials? Quite so. I do see that. Now you take a pride, don't you? Anyone can see that for himself. He waved a hand around the small kitchen, scattering little drops of foamy water, and she saw the room through his eyes, the clean windows, the shining taps, the immaculate sinks. Yes, she took a pride. That was true. Her mother had insisted upon it. Now she heard herself saying, my mother died only a fortnight ago. Forgetting that she had told him already and the shock of the fact overcame her again, she could not believe in the empty room which she was planning to give to Mr. Curry, and her eyes filled up with tears of guilt. And what would her mother have said about a strange man washing up in their kitchen, about this new, daring friendship. You should have consulted me, 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐻. You take far too much on trust. You never think. You should have consulted me. 2 days after her mother's funeral, Mrs. Bickerdike, from the Lilacs, had met her in the pharmacy and mentioned in lowered voice that she did work for the bereaved, which, 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐻 gathered, meant that she conducted séances. She implied that contact might be established with the deceased Mrs. Fanshawe. 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐻 had been shocked, most of all by the thought of that contact and a continuing relationship with her mother, though she had only said that she believed in letting the dead have their rest. I think, if you will forgive me, and with respect, that we are not meant to inquire about them or to follow them on. Now, she heard her mother talking about Mr. Curry. You should always take particular notice of the eyes, 𝐒𝐿𝐵𝐻. Never trust anyone with eyes set too closely together. She tried to see his eyes, but he was turned sideways to her, or else too widely apart. That indicates idleness. She was ashamed of what she had just said about her mother's recent death, for she did not at all wish to embarrass him or to appear hysterical. Mr. Curry had finished washing up and was resting his reddened wet hands upon the rim of the sink. When he spoke, his voice was a little changed and rather solemn. I do not believe in shutting away the dead, Miss Fanshawe. I believe in the sacredness of memory. I am only glad that you feel able to talk to me about the good lady. She felt suddenly glad to have him here in the kitchen, for his presence took the edge off the emptiness and silence which lately had seemed to fill up every corner of the house. She said, It was not always easy. My mother was a very forthright woman. Say no more. I understand only too well. The older generation believed in speaking their minds. She thought, he is obviously a very sensitive man. He can read between the lines. And she wanted to laugh with relief, for there was no need to go into details about how dominating her mother had been and how taxing were the last years of her illness. He knew. He understood. Mr. Curry dried his hands, smoothing the towel down one finger at a time, as though he were drawing on gloves. He rolled down his shirt sleeves and fastened them and put on his jacket. His movements were neat and deliberate. He coughed. Regarding the room, there is just the question of payment, Miss Fanshawe. I believe in having these matters out at once. There is nothing to be embarrassed about in speaking of money. I hope you agree. Oh no, certainly shall we say £4 a week? Her head swam. She had no idea at all how much a lodger should pay, how much his breakfasts would cost, and she was anxious to be both businesslike and fair. Well, he had suggested what seemed to him a most suitable sum. He was more experienced in these matters than herself. For the time being, I am staying at a commercial guest house in Cedars Road. I have only linoleum covering the floor of my room. There is nothing cooked at breakfast. I am not accustomed to luxury, Miss Fanshawe. You will understand that from what I have told you of my life. But I think I am entitled to comfort at the end of the working day. Oh, you will be more than comfortable here. I shall see to that. I shall do my very best. I feel... Yes? She was suddenly nervous of how she appeared in his eyes. I do feel that the mistake you made in the address was somehow fortuitous. Yes, oh yes. Mr. Curry gave a little bow. When would you wish to move in, Mr. Curry? There are one or two things. Tomorrow evening, say? Tomorrow is Friday. Perhaps that is inconvenient. No, certainly. Our week could begin on a Friday, as it were. I shall greatly look forward to having you as a landlady, Miss Fanshawe. Landlady. She wanted to say, I hope I shall be a friend, Mr. Curry, but it sounded presumptuous. When he had gone, she made herself a pot of tea and sat quietly at the kitchen table, a little dazed. She thought, this is a new phase of my life. But she was still a little alarmed. She had acted out of character and against what she would normally have called her better judgment. Her mother would have warned her against inviting strangers into the house, just as, when she was a child, she had warned her about speaking to them in the street. You can never be sure, Esme. There are some very peculiar people about. For she was a great reader of the crime reports in her newspapers and of books about famous trials. The life of Dr. Crippen had particularly impressed her. Esme shook her head. Now, all the plans she had made for selling the house and moving to London and going abroad were necessarily curtailed, and for the moment she felt depressed, as though the old life were going to continue. And she wondered, too, what neighbors and friends might say and whether anyone had seen Mr. Curry standing on her doorstep, paper in hand, whether, when he went from house to house selling cleaning utensils, they would recognize him as Miss Fanshawe's lodger and disapprove. There was no doubt that her mother would have disapproved, and not only because he was a stranger off the streets. He is a salesman, Esme, a doorstep peddler, and you do not know what his employment in the summer months may turn out to be. He has impeccable manners, Mother, quite old-fashioned ones, and a most genteel way of speaking. She remembered the gloves and the raised hat, the little bow, and also the way he had quietly and confidently done the washing up, as though he were already living here. How do you know where things will lead, Esme? I am prepared to take a risk. I have taken too few risks in my life so far. She saw her mother purse her lips and fold her hands together, refusing to argue further, only certain that she was in the right. Well, it was her own life now, and she was mistress of it. She would follow her instincts for once. And she went and got a sheet of paper on which to write a list of things that were needed to make her mother's old bedroom quite comfortable for him. After that, she would buy cereal and bacon and kidneys for the week's breakfasts. She was surprised at how little time it took for her to grow quite accustomed to having Mr. Curry in the house. It helped, of course, that he was a man of very regular habits and neat, too. When she had first gone into his room to clean it, she could have believed that no one was using it at all. The bed was neatly made, clothes hung out of sight in drawers. He had locked the wardrobe she discovered and taken away the key. Only 2 pairs of shoes side by side, below the wash basin, and a shaving brush and razor on the shelf above it, gave the lodger away. Mr. Curry got up promptly at 8. She heard his alarm clock, and then the pips of the radio news. At 8:20, he came down to the kitchen for his breakfast, smelling of shaving soap and shoe polish. Always, he said, "Ah, good morning, Miss Fanshawe. "Good morning to you," and then commented briefly upon the weather. "It was a bit nippy or a touch of sunshine, I see, or bleak." He ate a cooked breakfast, followed by toast and 2 cups of strong tea. Esme took a pride in her breakfasts, in the neat way she laid the table and the freshness of the cloth. She warmed his plate under the grill and waited until the last minute before doing the toast so that it should still be crisp and hot. She thought, "It is a very bad thing for a woman such as myself to live alone and become entirely selfish. I'm the sort of person who needs to give service." At 10 minutes to 9, Mr. Curry got his suitcase from the downstairs cupboard, wished her good morning again, and left the house. After that, she was free for the rest of the day to live as she had always lived, or else to make changes. Though much of her time was taken up with cleaning the house and especially Mr. Curry's room, and shopping for something unusual for Mr. Curry's breakfasts. She had hoped to enroll for lampshade-making classes at the Evening Institute, but it was too late for that year. They had told her she must apply again after the summer. So she borrowed a book upon the subject from the public library and bought frames and card and fringing and taught herself. She went to 1 or 2 bring-and-buy sales and planned to hold a coffee morning and do a little voluntary work for old people. Her life was full. She enjoyed having Mr. Curry in the house. Easter came, and she began wonder when he would change to his summer work and what that work might be. He never spoke of it. To begin with, he had come in between 5:30 and 6 every evening and gone straight to his room. Sometimes he went out again for an hour. She presumed to buy a meal somewhere and perhaps drink a glass of beer. But more often he stayed in, and Esme did not see him again until the following morning. Once or twice she heard music coming from his room, presumably from the radio, and she thought how nice it was to hear that the house was alive, a home for someone else. One Friday evening, Mr. Curry came down into the kitchen to give her the £4 rent, just as she was serving up lamb casserole. And when she invited him to stay and share it with her, he accepted so quickly that she felt guilty, for perhaps he went without an evening meal altogether. She decided to offer him the use of the kitchen, when a moment should arise which seemed suitable. But a moment did not arise. Instead, Mr. Curry came down 2 or 3 evenings a week and shared her meal. She got used to shopping for 2, and when he offered her an extra £1 a week, she accepted. It was so nice to have company, though she felt a little daring, a little carefree. She heard her mother telling her that the meals cost more than £1 a week. "Well, I do not mind. They give me pleasure. It is worth it for that." One evening, Mr. Curry asked her if she were good at figures, and when she told him that she had studied bookkeeping, asked her help with the accounts for the kitchen utensil customers. After that, 2 or 3 times a month, she helped him regularly. They set up a temporary office on the dining room table, and she remembered how good she had been at this kind of work. She began to feel useful, to enjoy herself. He said, "Well, it will not be for much longer, Miss Fanshawe. The summer is almost upon us, and in the summer, of course, I am self-employed." But when she opened her mouth to question him more closely, he changed the subject. Nor did she like to inquire whether the firm who supplied him with the cleaning utensils to sell objected to the dearth of summer orders. Mr. Curry was an avid reader. In the winter, he said, when he had the time. He read not novels or biographies or war memoirs, but his encyclopedia, of which he had a handsome set, bound in cream mock leather and paid for by monthly installments. In the evenings, he took to bringing a volume down to the sitting room, at her invitation, and keeping her company. She grew used to the sight of him in the opposite armchair. From time to time, he would read out to her some curious or entertaining piece of information. His mind soaked up everything, but particularly of a zoological, geographical, or anthropological nature. He said that he never forgot a fact and that you never knew when something might prove of use. And 𝐒𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐞 Fanshawe listened, her hands deftly fringing a lampshade. It was a skill she had acquired easily, and continued her education. One is never too old to learn, Mr. Curry. How splendid that we are of like mind. How nice. She thought, yes, it is nice, as she was washing up the dishes the next morning, and she flushed a little with pleasure and a curious kind of excitement. She wished that she had some woman friend whom she could telephone and invite round for coffee, in order to say, "How nice it is to have a man about the house, really. I had no idea what a difference it could make." But she had no close friends. She and her mother had always kept themselves to themselves. She would have said, "I feel younger, and it is all thanks to Mr. Curry. I see now that I was only half alive." Then it was summer. Mr. Curry was out until 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. The suitcase full of brooms and brushes and polish was put away under the stairs, and he had changed his clothing. He wore a cream linen jacket and a straw hat with a black band, a rose or carnation in his buttonhole. He looked very dapper, very smart, and she had no idea at all what work he was doing. Each morning he left the house carrying a black case, quite large and square. She thought, "I shall follow him," but she did not do so. Then, one evening in July, she decided to explore, to discover what she could from other people in the town, for someone must know Mr. Curry. He was a distinctive sight now in the fresh summer clothes. She had at the back of her mind some idea that he might be a beach photographer. She herself put on a quite different outfit, a white pique dress she had bought 15 years ago, but which still not only fitted but suited her, and a straw boater edged with ribbon, not unlike Mr. Curry's own hat. When she went smartly down the front path, she hardly dared to look about her, certain that she was observed and spoken about by the neighbors. For it was well known now that Miss Fanshawe had a lodger. She almost never went on to the promenade in the summer. She had told Mr. Curry so. "I keep to the residential streets, to the shops near home. I do so dislike the summer crowds." And besides, her mother had impressed on her that the summer visitors were quite common. But tonight, walking along in the warm evening air, smelling the sea, she felt ashamed of that opinion. She felt ashamed of that opinion. She would not like anyone to think that she had been brought up a snob. Live and let live, as Mr. Curry would tell her. And the people sitting in the deck chairs and walking in couples along the seafront looked perfectly nice, perfectly respectable. There were a number of older women and families with well-behaved children. This was a small, select resort, and charabancs were discouraged. but Mr. Curry was not to be seen. There were no beach photographers. She walked quite slowly along the promenade, looking all about her. There was a pool in which children could sail boats beside the War Memorial, and a putting green alongside the gardens of the Raincliff Hotel. Really, she thought, I should come out more often. Really, it is very pleasant here in the summer. I have been missing a good deal. When she reached the putting green, she paused, not wanting to go back, for her sitting room was rather dark, and she had no real inclination to make lampshades in the middle of July. She was going to sit down, next to an elderly couple on one of the green benches. She was going to enjoy the balm of the evening. Then, she heard music. After a moment, she recognized it. The tune had come quite often through the closed door of Mr. Curry's bedroom, and there, on a corner opposite the hotel and the putting green, she saw Mr. Curry. The black case contained a portable gramophone, the old-fashioned kind with a horn, and this was set on the pavement. Beside it was Mr. Curry, straw hat tipped a little to one side, cane beneath his arm, buttonhole in place. He was singing in a tuneful but rather cracked voice and doing an elaborate little tap dance on the spot, his rather small feet moving swiftly and daintily in time with the music. 𝐒𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐢𝐞 Fanshawe put her hand to her face, feeling herself flush and wishing to conceal herself from him. She turned her head away and looked out to sea, her ears full of the sentimental music. But Mr. Curry was paying attention only to the small crowd which had gathered about him. One or two passers-by on the opposite side of the road crossed over to watch as Mr. Curry danced, a fixed smile on his elderly face. At his feet was an upturned bowler hat, into which people dropped coins, and when the record ended, he bent down, turned it over neatly, and began to dance again. At the end of the second tune, he packed the gramophone up and moved on, farther down the promenade, to begin his performance all over again. She sat on the green bench, feeling a little faint and giddy, her heart pounding. She thought of her mother and what she would have said. She thought of how foolish she had been made to look, for surely someone knew, surely half the town had seen Mr. Curry. The strains of his music drifted up the promenade on the evening air. It was almost dark now. The sea was creeping back up the shingle. She thought of going home, of turning the contents of Mr. Curry's room out onto the pavement and locking the front door. She thought of calling the police, or her Uncle Cecil, of going to a neighbor. She had been humiliated, taken in, disgraced, and almost wept for the shame of it. And then, presently, she wondered what it was she had meant by shame. Mr. Curry was not dishonest. He had not told her what he did in the summer months. He had not lied. Perhaps he had simply kept it from her because she might disapprove. It was his own business. And certainly there was no doubt at all that in the winter months he sold cleaning utensils from door to door. He paid his rent. He was neat and tidy and a pleasant companion. What was there to fear? All at once, then, she felt sorry for him, and at the same time, he became a romantic figure in her eyes, for he had danced well, and his singing had not been without a certain style. Perhaps he had a fascinating past as a music hall performer. And who was she, 𝐒𝐭𝐨𝐫𝐢𝐞 Fanshawe, to despise him? What talent had she? Did she earn her living by giving entertainment to others? I told you so, Esme. What did I tell you? Told me what, Mother? What is it you have to say to me? Why do you not leave me alone? Her mother was silent. Quietly then, she picked up her handbag and left the green bench and the promenade and walked up through the dark residential streets, past the gardens sweet with stocks and roses, past open windows towards Park Walk. And when she reached her own house, she put away the straw hat, though she kept on the dress of white pique, because it was such a warm night. She went down into the kitchen and made coffee and set it with a plate of sandwiches and a plate of biscuits on a tray. And presently Mr. Curry came in, and she called out to him. She said, "Do come and have a little snack with me. I am quite sure you can do with it. I'm quite sure you are tired." And she saw from his face that he knew that she knew. But nothing was said that evening, or until some weeks later, when Mr. Curry was sitting opposite her, on a cold, windy August night reading from the volume Cow to Din. Esme Fanshawe said, looking at him, "My mother used to say, 'Mr. Curry, I always like a bit of singing and dancing, some variety. It takes you out of yourself, singing and dancing.'" Mr. Curry gave a little bow.